My name is Marion Weiss. I am a faculty member here at Penn, the Graham Chair Professor of Practice. And I'm also partner of Weiss Manfredi, Architecture, Landscape, Urbanism, my practice in New York City with Michael Manfredi. I grew up in Northern California, in the hills of Northern California. And our uncle, and actually was a family friend from Denmark who wasn't truly an uncle, but that's what we called him. He was an architect, had a small firm, and he designed the house we grew up in. And in growing up, he had a tiny practice, and it looked like he was enormous fun. He had all these models around his office. We got to hang out. And it seemed like he was having more fun than anybody I could think of who was a grown-up.
And then when you decide to go to the school, you studied there in California, or you decided?
No, it's interesting. I was also thinking at the same time I was going to be a concert pianist, a film director, a producer, an architect. All of these things seemed like possibilities. And I had cross-country scholarships at most of the California schools, and I'd only applied to a couple of East Coast schools. And I trained on a campus called Foothill Junior College by Ernest Kump, and the landscape was by Peter Walker. It was very beautiful. You know, all the buildings looked like pavilions. You could almost not see them because of the hills and the oak trees. And I loved the way the architecture and landscape came together. So I called the school, found out who designed it, reached out to Ernest Kump to see if I could speak with him about getting some guidance about where I should go to architecture school. And he met with me, but unlike my uncle who had 4 employees, he had 300. So I was all of a sudden quite rattled. But when I spoke with him about the things I admired about Foothill College and what I had hoped to study, where architecture and landscape seemed like they were really naturally connected, he said there was only one good school on the list that I had applied to, and that was University of Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson had a similar attitude about what it meant to create a place, which was equal parts architecture and landscape and setting. So I went there. In fact, I told him they were the only ones who didn't give me a cross-country scholarship, and he said, "What's more important, your days as a runner or your life as an architect?" So that's where I went, and the school really did bring those two worlds into focus at the same time, which, you know, has been instrumental in our practice, instrumental in my teaching, and I would say instrumental for the way we need to look at the world today. In particular, there were 2 faculty members that were very, very important to me. One was Ralph Lerner, who later became the Dean of Architecture at Princeton. He had sort of had a Cooper Union, Harvard, 9-square grid, very rigorous kind of, education. And he brought that to the school while we were also learning about concepts. And he was forever dissatisfied with all of our work. I got the top grade in my studio, which was a B+. That level of expectation was just, do it again, better, clear. He was just super tough. The counterpoint to that was Carlo Pelliccia, who was from Italy. He taught figure drawing. He also taught studio. He designed vestments for the Vatican. He drew with charcoal. Everything was very sensuous. And when I had him for figure drawing, I could be as relaxed and as intuitive as I knew those drawings would benefit from. And when I got to studio, I did everything I was supposed to do. And he was the one near the latter part of my years at UVA said, "Why can't you design your projects the way you draw figure drawings? Start in the middle. You might not get to the edges or the end." And he effectively said, "Don't be so dutiful. Do what's intuitive and find your way to the edges later, and maybe they don't even count." And so that was these 2 paradigms of discipline and intuition. It was not one or the other. It was really both of them that really profoundly influenced me. And I've carried those sort of 2 opposing views as parallel focusing agents as I've gone forward. In some ways, the course of my education began as an undergrad at University of Virginia, and then sort of came to Yale University as the next step for a Master of Architecture. And there you could say that, again, the conceptual armature of architecture was foregrounded. History theory was literally a thing, and history theory has really wandered a little bit to the edges, I would say, right now. in many schools. But at the time it was foregrounded, and Jim Sterling from London was a very important architect and faculty member at Yale. And when I had him for studio, he was a really interesting character, obviously, because the work was profoundly interesting. In many ways, he sort of took brutalism and postmodernism and modernism and sort of had those in his sort of peripheral vision, and then did these incredibly creative things. And I asked him a question, you're young, you're trying to figure out how you're going to do work as compelling as the masters. And I said, you're here in the States, you're doing, a couple of projects in the States. How do you get them to believe in these incredible forms you're doing? And he said, oh no, in the States I never talk about design, I just talk about technical matters. And it was interesting. He, in a sense, touched on something that I've learned, which is that often people have an enormous debate with you as an architect because they have a lot of strong ideas themselves. When you're an artist, you don't get that debate. And when you're talking about technical things that are outside of their terrain of insight, you don't get a debate. And so in many ways, he was touching on the place that he could avoid a debate, which was the technical side of things, even though clearly design was, the central focus for him. And oddly enough, right now in our practice, we're working on the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India. 27 acres, 12 buildings. It's an enormous project, halfway through construction right now. And, I think the design is beautiful. We really wanted to convince the State Department about certain things we were doing. And Tom Main, who's a friend and mentor, had said, Marion, don't talk about design. Just talk about security. And in a sense, he was saying that the values that need to be captured and embodied within the design have to do with the agenda that is really central to what they cannot miss, which in this case is security. Of course they believe you're going to do good design, but don't talk about it. And I thought, it's a weird thing, right? That the very thing we care deeply about, the thing that we bring value to, becomes the most challenging thing in a sense to be assured that it is equally valued when you're brought on to do projects, particularly if they're public. My partner, Michael Manfredi, and I had both studied, different schools, had brought different backgrounds. He was, Cornell, I was Yale, and we were working together for Aldo Jurgala, who was doing the Canberra Parliament headquarters. And he had won that as a competition. And what we had loved about Aldo and what we loved about working for him was that the competitions that he entered and prevailed in related to things that you could never pin down as being that's a building or that's a landscape or that's art. They were all of these things together. In fact, they were infrastructural in scale. In that case, it was city making, as it was also creating a parliament headquarters. And that was why I chose to work for him. I'd seen the pencil sketches that he'd done on the cover of magazines when I was in school. And he encouraged us when we left his office. I started teaching, Michael started teaching. He encouraged us to enter competitions as a way of being able to address the kinds of questions that we were interested in. So we entered two competitions very close to each other. The first one was the Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. There were 126 submissions, and we were fortunate enough to be selected. And so that put us on the national stage very quickly, and that was our first competition that we had won, and we learned a lot about working with different agencies and approvals and contractors and subconsultants and hiring all of our favorite students and a few grown-ups to help us start our practice. And then very soon after that, when I started teaching at Penn, we won the New American Green competition, which was a 20-acre park and community center. And that one, there were over, I think, 200 submissions. So we were lucky. We had a really lucky start where the first two competitions we entered, we won and got them built. And so that put us in a slightly different category of being able to pursue work that was more public, which interested us, rather than, homes or offices or some of the things that often are part of the foundation of many beginning practices. And it also enabled us to engage projects that were distinctly hard to categorize by discipline. They were really doing that. And then right after that, we won the Bridging the Gaps competition, which was a bridge extension to Brooklyn Bridge. Never got realized. It was an ideas competition. And so the kind of cadence of priorities and competition opportunities were really beautifully aligned for us to basically support our habit of having a practice by teaching, being able to pay our staff by our teaching. And, we hoped that someday our practice would earn enough money that it would sustain itself, which, always takes a little while. What's so interesting is that to some extent we always think that every project that we have is an excuse to do something we've never done. And it's an excuse for research, it's an excuse to learn something new. Right now we're working on the Nelson Atkins competition. I think they had like 183 and we're down to 6. That's due in a couple of weeks, so that's very much on our mind, which is what does it mean to add to a museum which has been in some ways a beautiful encyclopedic museum, but in a sense not conveying its desire to invite a larger community in. They really want to be a museum for all. So how does an addition begin to open up what it can be in addition and renovation, and really, in this case, engage a compelling site in a compelling city in Kansas City. So that's sort of front and center right now because we are in the midst of the competition. We're also very excited about the 2 other projects right now that are very much in the hot seat right now. One is we're doing the rejuvenation and transformation reimagining for La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, and that was an international competition that we were thrilled to win. We're finishing the construction documents. Our EIR was just approved. This is very exciting. Fundraising is still, a high priority. So that's one, again, where it's history, it's paleontology, it's urban on the edge of Wilshire Boulevard next to Peter Zumthor's, hovering museum. So it's trying to make sense of a very complicated area and reveal literally in new ways this paleontological Pleistocene past, which, by the way, is sort of one of the most amazing witnesses of climate change and is really informing us now. So that's kind of on one end. And the other is that we are doing Lincoln Center's new theater, outdoor theater on Dam Marsh Park, with Walter Hood being the designer of the park, Hood Design. And that's very exciting because it's it will probably be the first theater that Lincoln Center has done in 60 years and maybe the last. What's most distinct about it is that it's open air and every event is free to the public. So it's really an act of generosity, cultural generosity, an act of urbanism, and in this case, an act of bringing the legacy of San Juan Hill, which had been destroyed with, urban renewal, which is what, created Lincoln Center as this big compound, but also eliminated a very creative neighborhood and critical neighborhood. It's really returning that gift of that part of the city and giving voice to a legacy, in a sense, that has been overlooked and really is time to be celebrated. So that's an amazing project. We're in the thick of it. Every week we have meetings that, in a sense, reframe certain values and priorities that need to be captured in this kind of theater, plaza, amphitheater area, and with vistas back to Lincoln Center's core and heart and opening out to the city. So that's, again, these are almost acupuncture-like because while they may be finite in scale, the obligations and intentions and opportunity really is to allow these things to be very open-armed. And we just finished, and it's really linked to a studio that I'm doing here at Penn, the first living, breathing conservatory here, I think probably in the US, for Longwood Gardens. And it's a building, in this case, that's a full glass house with a Mediterranean climate that is looking at, the kind of landscape of this kind of drier, hotter climate that we're going to be in. But under glass, in this kind of, wintry moment that we're in right now, we're using earth ducts, a fully active wall, an active roof, deployable shades, geothermal, a climate control center that activates this entire perimeter, with a series of these kind of groves of columns that in many ways take the kind of grove of trees outside right into the building. And it's so exciting to think about Longwood Gardens' legacy of being the most visited garden in the United States, devoted to beauty and display, to now looking at things like climate issues and creating places, particularly even as COVID told us that outdoor environments or even semi-conditioned environments are safer than indoor environments, and looking at how the preservation of botanic life, which is so fragile, you know, where social and sort of environmental worlds have become so fragile, that in some ways this very specific kind of building in the rejuvenation of all of Longwood Gardens, we did several buildings there, is kind of pinpointing this importance of recognizing that beauty matters in the midst of all these really important questions about climate change, our social worlds, and the fragility of it all. So we're advancing this idea of the Agile Conservatory, the living, breathing building in my studio here as we look at a climate campus that's being developed on Governor's Island. And you know, it's just super interesting to recognize that passive systems, in our case, the Longwood Gardens project, we have 3,000 linear feet of earth tubes, which are basically taking for free, after you've done the infrastructure, 55-degree temperatures in that are either cooler or warmer than whatever season that the environment is trying to condition. In fact, when we were pursuing competitions that followed, it was amazing how many ways that we would say our Women's Memorial and Education Center was really a school, or it was really a kind of a public diplomacy center. You know, we were really trying to, in a sense, use those projects as a way of saying we have capability beyond these types. And that's always the trip hazard of saying you need to have done many, many of these particular kinds of projects to even be considered. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunities that are studiously designed to say they're looking for designers with fresh ideas. And if they feel that those younger designers might benefit from an affiliate firm, for instance, they might recommend that. But I think competitions still continue to be one of the most compelling ways, in addition to exhibition design, for instance, and you know, sort of effectively having public places to celebrate ideas. They are among the best ways to advance things creatively rather than, in a sense, just simply responsibly. I always look with some wistfulness when I see, you know, incredibly beautiful projects being developed in South America or in India or in China. Clearly, ADA, handrails, you know, coping requirements, you know, thermal modeling and all that are things that are not exactly captured in some of those forms, which are fearless and beautiful and often made out of a single material that's doing, you know, amazing things. And I look at those with a certain level of wistfulness, because the considerations, particularly because our projects are public, have to deal with everything. And yet it makes you become an expert on the kind of technological requirements so that they can be manipulated with care to offer, say, in some cases, the expression of slenderness is not intrinsic to the way the detail is, or can become invisible in ways that addressed on, you know, the surface need to be highly visible. So it means that the level of care and discipline is not unlike, say, the way I characterize it as having been trained to become a concert pianist, is that the ridiculous amount of exercises that go into the left hand, which tends to be weaker than the right, particularly the 3/4 finger, which, you know, the trills you have to practice 3/4. It's the rehearsal, preparation that means that the actual performance can sound effortless. Same thing with say, an ice skate or whatever. It's the amount of training and repetition that ultimately creates a state of intuitive ability to transcend the awkwardness of what it actually takes to be able to incorporate yet transcend the immediate expression of those obligations. So it's harder, but it's a necessary thing to do, because some people I know like to work on projects to a certain level and then hand it off to an associate architect. Our feeling is everything goes wrong during bidding, negotiation, suggestions for substitutions, and construction. And you've got to be there every minute of that whole process so that you can leverage opportunities that might come along, or you can be rigorous about the things that were documented. So I would say in this country, we are spending more and more time during construction administration than ever, because there's so many incentives and challenges for contractors to do things a little bit faster and maybe with a little less investment. So it's harder.
But do you think that's important, the regulations and also the industrialization?
You know, many of them for sure are important. You know, you think about the disasters that have led to regulations. Had it not been for the shirtwaist factory fire, we wouldn't have sprinklers, for instance. Had it not been for the experience of the outcomes of earthquakes that caused, you know, comprehensive collapses, we wouldn't have the earthquake codes, particularly in California. And we're doing 2 buildings for the University of California, Berkeley right now, including a data science center, and another is a lab for Jennifer Doudna, who's a Nobel Prize winner. And our seismic requirements are, you know, sky high in terms of expectation. And to be able to meet those, you kind of look at it and you think, well, those came from things that failed. And so they're there for good reasons. So I would argue even the same thing for the energy criteria too. Our coatings on glasses, our obligations to have a certain level of opacity and transparency or other offsetting things are tied to the fact that we don't have all that much energy to waste. And so we need to be mindful of those regulations. So many of them, I think, are very, very important. Some of them are, in a sense, conceived to be really important for some things and maybe are universally applied in areas that one wonders whether there could be some broader interpretation. Both my partner Michael Manfredi and I have been teaching and practicing at the same time all the time, and it's hard to imagine the two not making sense with each other. We started out first as just being exclusively teachers trying to have a practice, and now we are doing both. And what I think the beginning was, when I started teaching, I was more or less the same age of the students I was teaching. And you know, here at Penn, my first year of teaching, some of those students are still friends, and we're all kind of the same age, which is a curious sort of phenomenon now, because now obviously there's a big difference. What was interesting is in the beginning, particularly with the mentorship of the chair at the time, David Leatherborough, was that history, theory, conceptual design, site specificity, and architecture were a thread that was being caught within the rubric of theory. And so while I was teaching design-focused studios, I was also teaching some urbanism courses and also teaching courses on representation. And all of those threaded really beautifully together as something that was seamless here in the kind of academic setting of Penn. I have been moving more towards really looking at the critical intersections of architecture, landscape, urbanism, ecology, art, and landform building as things that have intertwining sorts of priorities, and to some extent discovering that the focus of my interest in my teaching now is in the interstices between all of these disciplines, and that is where I believe the disciplinary boundaries that have been established between all these particular elements have been, to some cases, destructive, and seem to preclude the smartest, you know, kinds of ways to address challenges. And so that's again where competitions and teaching together are great ways to think more broadly. I think of, you know, the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle, which was open to artists, landscape architects, and architects at the same time, because the museum didn't know where the right answer was going to come from. And they were so smart to say, we don't know, and anybody can lead. And that became an opportunity to do this, you know, 200,000 cubic yard earthwork that crossed the highway and train tracks and created salmon habitat underwater, and you know, created bridges over, you know, things, and restored a failing seawall, and had a Kunsthal of a pavilion, and incorporated the work of Richard Serra, among others. It was everything all at once. And it was the everything all at once, as opposed to what is it, that enabled us to do what we thought was an important sort of transformation of a part of a city that had been really separated from the water's edge. And art, in a sense, had been really associated with the more exclusive world of these interior museums. So, you know, again, I think it's teaching and practice are scenario building in both cases in different ways, and informing each other. I think schools have in some ways really benefited from the debate, and there's been too little of it. And I think one of the great things about Penn right now is that in many ways it carried this really rich thread of history theory as a foundational kind of point of teaching and making and learning. Earlier, when I began teaching, the computational paradigm became one that really grew and became more robust. And Penn, in many ways, brought that great strength forward, to a very, very high level, continuing now with even robotics and some of the other elements that are leveraging all the kind of important capabilities in there. And now with Rosanna Hu, I think it's also saying that there's a world that is architectural in the kind of making sense, that has a kind of inextricably rich capacity to leverage all of these histories and bring it forward to a new place. So from my point of view, it's never been better. This is an amazing time to be here, because the school's carried, I would say, almost a jazz, like a jazz quartet. It's richer because of the differences rather than the similarities. And I feel like I've been able to benefit from those kind of parallel conversations and be a part of its evolution. Certainly I've been fortunate to be, kind of a thesis advisor at SciArc and participate in many of their reviews, and to see a little bit, been at UCLA very recently to give a lecture, and seen, some of what I would call the West Coast in LA as a particular paradigm. And I would say that the kind of world of fearless making really stands forward there in a unique way. And I would say here at Penn, and I came from Yale and met the reviews there, same thing with Columbia, Harvard, where my partner Michael Manfredi teaches. You could say that there is a thread on the East Coast corridor that carries a certain set of commonalities that are distinctly different in each school, but there is a conversation that wanders up and down the coast because, among other things, faculty and jurors share conversations there. And in some ways, what's really interesting about your question is that we have just published our new book called Drifting Symmetries, Projects, Provocations, and Other Enduring Models. And one of the things that we feel lucky about is we've been able to bring in certain voices for reflections as we've looked simultaneously at certain paradigms that have influenced us, where we've kind of unpacked those along with our own projects in the book. And the ones that have influenced us have been, in many ways, just a little bit outside of our education, but very much seminal to our thinking. So things like the Agrasan-Kiboli stepwell in India, for instance, or the Kaju Bridge in Isfahan, are projects that are infrastructures. They are, in some cases, places that have had different roles over different times. And then we've sort of looked at contemporary models as well, where we look at even, say, Korb's Carpenter Center or Udsen's Opera House, and talked about that liminal space of movement and site building and site creation and invention as threads that have been important to us. And so we're unpacking that, and we've opened this conversation up to our colleagues, not just on the East Coast corridor, but West Coast and Asia and India, and really just said to them, as you reflect on these kind of influences and enduring models, what are the things that come forward to you? So in a sense, I think the gift to us of teaching is this kind of exchange. And so this book in many ways has been kind of a work of love. 2 years later than we planned to get it out, because books always take time. But the title Drifting Symmetries has touched on the fact that, it goes back to your question, what thread is more important? And it's not singular. And symmetry, we could always say, has been a paradigm in architecture. We look at architectural history, and the paradigms tend to be, symmetrical church, a symmetrical this, Those are the things that seem to be enduring over time. And yet the ones for us that endure are the ones that have just a little bit of drift in them. And they tend to thrive over time and over centuries. And we're trying to figure out what that drift is. And in all of our projects, we're trying to enable that drift to invite, forces that are well beyond the boundaries of the actual project to enter, to influence, and maybe be influenced by our projects. So, to your point there, I think it's the flow of these conversations, priorities, and values that makes things exciting right now and richer. In the future, our hope is that the kinds of projects we can engage continue to be important because of their social dimension, their urbanistic dimension, maybe even their infrastructural dimension. It would be wonderful to work in other countries. We're really enjoying effectively learning almost at the rate of a child as we've worked on this project in India about what things we can bring to the expression of architecture that we might not bring to the expression of architecture in the States. And we did the Taekwondo, we won the competition for the Taekwondo headquarters in Muju, South Korea, and that was an opportunity to really look at that landform and that philosophical premise of Taekwondo as a way of thinking about making. So our hunch is that if we can work on projects that are asking questions that we've never engaged before, but that are broader and are enduring, are important for the ages in some fashion or another, those are the ones that we really want to enter.